Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing the August 2026 clubs for Spellbinders. First, here we have the 3D embossing folder of the month called Spooky Web, and you can see there's two embossing folders in one there. Then we have the embossing folder of the month called Happy Jacks. This is the stencil of the month called Peekaboo, and once you do all those layers together, you get this adorable little scene. The clear stamp and coordinating die of the month is called Trick or Snark, and it has some really fun sentiments in there that are just a touch little snarky. Then we have the Better Press of the month called Boo Humbug, and I'm going to do two cards with this, one with the Better Press system and one with the Glimmer system. And this month it comes with a little Better Press pad. Then we have the large die of the month called Boo Mobile. So adorable, creating that scene. The die of the month is called Boo Crew Lab. And in this video, I'm going to add a couple elements to make some of the things glow. So it adds a fun element to these cards. This is the stitching die of the month called Frank in Stitch. Then we have the Scaredy Cat All Clubs Crate exclusive die of the month. And last but certainly not least, we have the Clubs Crate bonus item, which is the Make a Monster die set. So I'm going to start off by using the embossing folder of the month, Happy Jacks. And for this one, I'm going to use some of that glow-in-the-dark embossing powder with it. But first, I'm taping it into my embossing folder, and I'm using some black ink on the opposite side of the embossing folder so that the faces are going to be orange. The background is going to be black. I do want to apologize for a moment because for some reason, for the first card and part of the second card, anything on my desk is a little bit blurry. Once I raise it to the camera, it comes clear. I didn't change settings on my phone. I didn't clean my camera lens every time before I film. So I'm not really sure what happened, and on its own, it corrected itself. So it doesn't last the whole video. And for some reason, it's only when things are on my desk for the first, like I said, first card and a little bit of the second one. So it does clear up. So I'm going to repeat this same process a couple times until I get as much ink on that background as I want. And because that cardstock is taped into that embossing folder, I don't have to worry about that cardstock moving. And I like to use a dye ink for this so that once I'm completely done, I can just rinse this under the tap. I don't have to use any special cleaner or anything on my embossing folder. And because it's a dye ink, it just rinses right off. So I typically will do this technique about 3 times. Now we have a background here that could be used all on its own if you want, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to make those faces glow using embossing powder, glow-in-the-dark embossing powder. The first thing I want to do though is I want to use some embossing powder tool on that background just to soak up any possible moisture. I don't want my embossing powder to stick to that background. I want it to stick to the raised faces. So I put that embossing powder tool on there, and then I use just some clear embossing powder, pouring it onto that background just to make sure that everything's dry and that embossing powder isn't going to stick where I don't want it to. Any of the areas that I found that embossing powder was sticking, I'm just going to add a little bit more embossing powder tool to it. Again, just to make sure that everything is completely dry before the next step. And obviously test it once again, just to make sure that everything is totally dry. And that's the easiest way to do it, is pour some embossing powder on there. Anything that embossing powder would stick to, obviously, is going to make that embossing powder stick. If in your testing something sticks, you could just use a soft brush to remove any of that embossing powder so it doesn't need to stay there. I have my Versamark ink pad, and I'm using a brayer to ink the top raised parts of my embossed background. The best way to do this is with a brayer because you have a little bit more control. Because that Versamark pad is foam and really, really spongy, if you just rub that pad on the surface, because it's just a 2D embossed folder, it's not super raised, and it would be really easy to get embossing ink all over that background. Any area that there might be some ink on that background that the glow embossing powder is sticking to, I'm just using a soft brush to remove it. So once we have that completely removed, we can use our embossing tool in order to heat that powder and melt that. And because it has a little bit of a yellow tone, it does change the orange color just a little bit. It also has a matte finish to it. So it changes the finish of the cardstock just a little bit. It doesn't have a gloss finish like most embossing powders do. It has a matte finish. Now, in this video, I'll try to show you the glow, but it doesn't show really, really well simply because it was a really sunny day when I was filming this, and I turned all my lights off and closed my curtains, but there's still light coming through. So you can't see the glow as well in the video. I have pictures that I will put on my blog on my website, and those show the glow really well. I waited until it was nighttime, until it was completely dark, and took pictures, and those show the glow really well. Although because it's dark, you can't see the rest of the details of the different cards. This one, obviously, because the glow is in the faces, you can see all of those faces. But for some of the other cards where I used the grit paste glow, you don't really see it as much in the dark pictures because you can't see the die cuts. You can only see the glow areas. But I wanted to show somewhere that it does show those glow features on there. I know there's also a way you could insert and overlay a photo in a video. And if I can figure out how to do that, I will add that in here. And then you don't have to necessarily go to my blog to see the pictures there. Hopefully I can do that. So I took my cardstock with the embossed pumpkins on it, and I trimmed that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I have another piece of carrot cardstock that I trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches to use as a mat. I'm just going to glue those two onto my A2 card base. I'm going to put my acrylic block on there just to hold everything nice and flat, and here is that background. I'm going to set that to the side and create some sentiments using the clear stamp of the month, the Trick or Snark. I'm going to do several sentiments so that I have sentiments for the rest of the cards in the video. Now, this stamp set hadn't been used at this point, so I used a white eraser on the stamping surface just to remove any possible manufacturing residue and help that stamp take ink just a little bit better. I'm going to heat emboss these sentiments with some black embossing powder just to make it so that they show up nicely. It also gives that sentiment just a little bit of a raised texture as well as a nice shiny texture. I typically like to heat emboss my sentiments just because I think it gives them a little bit more presence on the card. So once I have my stamps positioned onto my hammer mill cardstock, I use some embossing powder tool just to make sure that my embossing powder only sticks to that embossing ink on the cardstock. If by chance you get some grains of embossing powder stick where you don't want them to, you can just use a soft brush to remove them before you use the heat embossing and melt them onto your paper. Once it's melted onto the cardstock, you can't remove it after that. So I put my piece onto some scrap cardstock or scrap paper and then pour on that embossing powder. I pour on a liberal amount. You can take all of the excess off. All of the excess goes right back into that container, so there's no waste. So you don't have to worry about only pouring a little bit on there. Then I use my heat tool to melt those sentiments. And these have coordinating dies to them. So once I have them all melted, I will let this cool for just a few seconds, like 5-10 seconds. Then I will start matching up my dies and cut out those sentiments. I typically like to create a ton of sentiments, have them ready to go. So while I'm creating, I have a bunch of sentiments to pick and choose from that I can grab. If by chance I have any extras once I'm done, I just put them in a little Ziploc bag right with that set. So then next time I want to use that set, I might already have a sentiment completed that is going to work for the project that I'm creating. I use a little bit of Best Ever craft tape in order to tape that die in place, just to make sure that when I run it through my machine, it's not going to move on me in any way. And those pieces of Best Ever craft tape I use over and over again, probably a good half dozen times until they don't stick anymore. So you can get a lot of use out of those pieces of tape. So nice and quickly, we have a ton of sentiments done, ready to go. So I can take those and sit those to the side. It's definitely worth it to create a ton of sentiments at once so that you don't have to stop in the middle of your creating to create a sentiment for that particular creation. So I picked the one that I'm going to be using on the Happy Jacks card, and I'm just going to glue it about 2/3 from the bottom and put my acrylic block on there so that it dries nicely. And here is that finished card. And I did figure out how to put a picture-in-picture on the video, so you can see it on the top left of the screen. In the dark, it glows really, really nicely. Next, I'm going to use that stencil of the month, the Peekaboo, and we're going to layer up these different stencils just to create this fun background. So I'm using my sticky mat. There is only about a 1/4 inch of the stencil around my hammer mill cardstock there, so I'm just using a little bit of painter's tape to hold it in place just to make sure that it's nice and secure. I'm using some distress ink in order to ink blend that. I'm starting with some Wilted Violet. Then I'm going to go in and make it a little bit darker around the edges with some Villainous Potion. I want the background to be a little bit darker or look a little bit darker, but I want it to be light towards the center. And then I want my pumpkins to be nice and bright. And there is some negative space with these stencils that create the ghosts with them, which is a really fun feature. If there was a stencil to it, I probably would have made those ghosts glow, but the negative space is what makes those ghosts on that image there. So the only option would be to use, say, a Versamark pen and color in those areas to put in the ghost there, but I opted not to. I found different ways to add some texture and fun to this background. For the pumpkins themselves, I'm using Carved Pumpkin Distress ink, and I'm using large ink blending brushes for this. It makes it really easy to color in really quickly. You can see as I'm coloring them, I have some areas that are lighter, some areas that are darker, and I do that intentionally. I just think it gives it a little bit more visual interest to it. So I'll typically make the outer areas darker for these pumpkins, inner areas lighter. To add just a little bit of extra shimmer to it, I'm using some Pumpkin Spice Interference ink. Interference ink is almost like two pads in one. There's one color that shows up on white or light cardstock and a different color that shows up on black or dark cardstock. In this case, for the Pumpkin Spice, the orange is what shows up on white or light cardstock, and then there's a purple shimmer to it that shows up on black or dark cardstock. But even when you use it on light cardstock, if you tilt it into the light, you can see a little bit of that purple shimmer, and it's really just such a fun feature for stenciling backgrounds because it gives it that little bit of extra visual texture with that shimmer to it. So I realized I missed that one little corner there, so I used that stencil number 1 there, and I was just filling in the corner. For this background here, I don't plan on trimming it down for my card. You certainly could, but then you're gonna lose some of those pumpkins around the edges. So I opted not to. So because I realized I had missed one little corner of that purple there, I just wanted to fill that in. For the vines to the pumpkin, I'm using some crushed olive distress ink, and I'm heavier handed with that ink where the vine attaches to the pumpkin, and a little bit lighter handed towards the end of the little stem. For the faces on the pumpkin, I'm using some Rusty Hinge. You could also use black here if you wanted. Another option here would be to use some Grit Paste Glow. I'm going to use that in several other cards, but you could use that here instead if you wanted. I opted for this background to use black texture paste for the next layer, which is has bats as well as the eyes to the ghost. So I didn't want to do, I don't typically do 2 different layers with texture paste. First of all, the drying time is probably a good hour. Secondly, it's harder to position the second stencil when you have that raised bit from the texture paste. So I opted just to do those pumpkin faces in the Rusty Hinge and leave it as is. I'm going to do this layer here with the black texture paste. Like I said, this is opaque texture paste, but I'm going to add some extra texture to the bats on there. I want to make them sparkle just a little bit. So once I have the texture paste filled in all of the areas, I'll remove that stencil, and while that paste is still wet, I'll take some transparent microfine glitter and just sprinkle it on top of the bats. I'm making sure not to put it on top of the ghost eyes. I don't really want them to sparkle. I want to see 2 different textures here. I want to see the black on the eyes, and then I want to see my ghost, but I want to have them sparkly. And because I'm using transparent paste here, it is going to have the black showing through. Now I started that first one there and I tapped the excess off, and then realized for these other ones, just the way they're positioned, if I tap them off, I'm going to get some glitter on the ghost eyes. So I opted to put that glitter on there and then let that completely dry before removing the excess and just brushing that excess off. So we have just plain black opaque texture paste for the eyes of the ghost, but we have black texture paste that is glittered for the bats themselves. So it just adds another fun texture to that background. I always love finding ways to add texture to things because I think it just gives it more interest. There's more things to look at, and it gives it a little bit more of a wow factor. It takes it to the next level in my opinion. So I glued that straight to my A2 card base, and then I added a sentiment in that center part there. And again, I chose not to trim that stenciled background down because I really didn't want to lose any of that background. You certainly could if you wanted to, but I think it's fabulous as is. For the next 2 cards, I'm going to be using the Boo Humbug Better Press of the Month. And this one's a registration Better Press, so it does have a registration template with it. Now, you do not want to use this on my Glimmer machine, so you'll see that my Glimmer machine is off right now as I'm positioning that plate there. I put little marks on the 4 corners of my Glimmer system with some black Sharpie, and that does fade over time, but you can add those marks there. This just helps me to position my cardstock on top of the piece. It also helps me to position that ghost exactly where I want it to go so that I know exactly where it's going to be on my A2 cardstock piece. I definitely recommend it. It helps you to position things because if you don't, you're kind of going in blind. It doesn't really matter if you're just doing something, say sentiments on the background where you're going to die cut them, but for something like this where you want it positioned properly, it's definitely very helpful. Now, anytime I do my foiling, and I did this foiling with opal glimmer foil. It's transparent, so you see that white cardstock through it. It would show whatever color cardstock you're doing this on through it, but it has that really fun iridescent finish to it. I always solid hot foil when I do my foiling. I'm not going to be using this solid hot foiling in this video, but I wanted to show it. It's much easier to store this piece of cardstock with the foil on it than those little flimsy foil sheets. They would just get damaged. So I opt to do this every single time, and I just save those pieces. Sometimes I'll use them in cards. Sometimes I'll use them as specialty cardstock to die cut pieces. You could easily use it as specialty cardstock to die cut these ghosts if you want. Now you see that I'm creating two ghosts here. One is for this card and one is for the next one, but I might as well assemble them all at the same time. I used a little bit of Lost Shadow Distress ink on the base of the ghost as well as the arms. It's just going to give it a little bit of visual dimension. And then for the little cheeks and the tongue, those are die cut out of some blush cardstock. So nice pale features to it. The cardstock behind the mouth is anchor cardstock. I didn't want it too stark and black, but you could certainly do black cardstock there as well. So we have our two ghosts here. I'm going to set those to the side and just use one of them for this card here. But I want that ghost to show up a little bit better. So I'm going to do some ink blending on my background. I'm going to start with some hickory smoke on the bottom. Then I'm going to do some wilted violet in the middle third of the card, and then the villainous potion on the top areas. Now that glimmer foil is going to resist that ink, so it's really going to make the ghost show up really well on this background. And then I'm going to use some dry paper towel just to remove any ink that sits on that glimmer foil, because even though it's resisting the ink, there's still ink there, and you can see it just tints it a little bit. So by using that paper towel, it will help remove that. Now, after doing this, I wanted to add just a touch more shimmer, so I used a little bit of Regal Gray interference ink on the bottom gray part of that background. So again, this adds that gray color, but this one has a purple interference to it. So when you tilt the card into the light, you're going to see a little bit of that purple shimmer. Then I'm using some crushed velvet. This one is a purple color, but it has a gold shimmer to it. I'm only doing it around the edges. I'm not covering all of that distress ink. I just wanted to add some areas that had a little bit of shimmer and just added something to the background, just a little bit. So that is mostly around the edges, and then when you tilt it into the light, you see that little bit of gold shimmer. Then we use that paper towel just to remove any of the ink from on top of that glimmer foiling. Every time between ink blending on different things on my mat, I always clean my mat off with a damp microfiber cloth and then set it to the side to dry. I don't want to accidentally lift up some of the ink from a previous card, so it's always a good habit to completely clean off your mat. For this one here, I didn't trim that background down. I thought it was cute the way it is. I'll get into moods where I'll do trim and mats, and then I'll get into moods where I just don't do them. So it just really depends on how I'm feeling at the time and what I want the final look to look like. So I'm going to take that same Better Press plate and I'm going to use it in the Better Press system. So I'm taping that registration plate down, just using a couple pieces of Best Ever Craft tape, and I just save those pieces with the Better Press system so that anytime I'm using something with a registration plate, I can just use those pieces of tape over and over again. I'm using that black ink pad that comes with the Better Press plate of the month this month and inking one of the sentiments on the bottom. For this card, I want to use that glow-in-the-dark embossing powder for my ghost. So I want to do my sentiment separate from my ghost itself. Now, I had just inked up my Versamark pad, so it is very sticky and it really wanted to move my plate on me. So if you have to move the plate back, just do it from the sides of the plate. Be very, very careful not to touch the top of it. Now, this background didn't turn out the way I had envisioned. I had envisioned my whole ghost being embossed and completely showing up on my background like my last card. But what I didn't anticipate or think of when I was thinking of this is the glow-in-the-dark embossing powder has a matte finish to it. So when you ink blend over embossing powder, if it has a glossy finish to it, it resists that ink. Matte doesn't, because it has that rough texture to it that ink sits in. So when I go to do my ink blending on the background of this, you'll see that it goes right over this glow-in-the-dark embossing powder. There's a couple areas where that embossing powder is really thick around the outside with like buildup from that Versamark ink. So you'll see the glow in the dark there, but most of the ghost kind of gets covered. You see some of the details, but it's not a complete contrast like the last card. But I kind of like it. So I kept going with it rather than scrapping the idea, because I wanted to share it and I wanted to show you why it didn't totally resist, because some of those areas that are thicker with that embossing powder is where it shows up. But because the rest of it is matte, the ink sticks to it. So it creates a completely different look to it, but it kind of looks funky. So again, that's why I kept going with it, because it had a really interesting look to it, in my opinion. And you can see, I will inlay a photo for this as well once the card is done. You can see that it does glow in the dark. Some areas are definitely brighter than others, but it has a really cool look to it that I was really happy with. So I did trim this piece down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches, just so that you can have a mat around this one, just to make it a little bit different from the last one. Then I'm going to glue on the die cut ghost in front of it. And I chose to do this ghost in white, but you could certainly do it in another color if you wanted. I did turn my lights off, but you can see that we still get a lot of light here coming in here. So once again, I'll inlay that photo so you can see it. So you can see that at the top left there. And obviously in the dark, you can't see the die cut ghost nearly as well, but it does have a fun glow in the dark feature that would be surprising. For the next card, I'm going to use the image stamp from the clear stamp of the month, and we're going to watercolor it. So I'm using some watercolor cardstock here. I'm going to heat emboss this with black embossing powder, and then I'm going to watercolor it with those interference inks. Now, when you watercolor with interference inks, you do get some of the shimmer where that ink is heavy, but you don't get it everywhere. So it just adds a different interesting look to watercolor. You could also use like distress refills or whatever you like to watercolor. That would absolutely work as well. There is a coordinating die to this, so once it's watercolored and it has dried, I will be die cutting it, and then I'll be using the 3D embossing folder for a background for this. So I'm starting off by using the crushed velvet interference pad. I just smush it onto my acrylic block, and that way I can pick up the ink from there. If you happen to have re-inkers for your interference pad, you could also shake those up really, really well and just put like a dot of the re-inker and use that as your paint as well. This just works a little bit more conveniently because I can choose areas where there is less ink. The areas that have the heavier ink on my acrylic block, I know we're going to have the most concentrated amounts of that little interference color. Next, I'm going to use the pumpkin spice, and you can see that there's not nearly as much ink on that pad as there is the other one, so I definitely have to re-ink that one. And I'm going to color a few different areas. So I'm going to do that little pumpkin balloon, and I'm going to do some of the other balloons. And typically when I'm watercoloring like this, especially like a clump of balloons, I try to not make two of the same balloon the same color right next to each other, so I try to mix them up just a little bit. Once I need to clean up my acrylic block, I just use the damp microfiber cloth just to clean off the ink, just to have a clear palette for the next color. This one is the Regal Gray, so we're going to see the gray color, but in the areas where that ink is heaviest on the watercolor, we're going to get just a touch of that purple shimmer on there. So it's going to coordinate nicely with the rest of them. So I use that for the bat, for the ghost, as well as another balloon. And for that ghost, I put that color on there, and then I just used or cleaned off my brush and took some of that off of there, so we didn't have it quite as heavy on there. Next, we're doing the Magical Garden interference. So this one is a nice bright vibrant green, but the interference color to it is purple, so you're going to get a little purple shimmer in some of the heavier areas for that one there. So once I have this completely done, I'm going to let this dry for a little bit. It doesn't take too long for it to dry because I don't really add a whole lot of water to it. The brush that I'm using has water right in the handle. So to my right, I have a piece of paper towel that I'll just use to squeeze the excess color out of and clean up my bristles to the brush. It makes it really, really easy. I don't have to have a jar of water on my desk because I tend to be a klutz and I would probably tip it over or drink it. So this is what works for me. I'm going to let this totally dry, and while that's drying, I'm going to work on my background. So I have some anchor cardstock here. I put it in the spider web side of my 3D embossing folder. So this one has one side that is like a spider web background, and then the other side is kind of like a stitched background that's going to work really, really well with the stitching die of the month, and that's what I'm going to be using it with. Now we have that beautiful background there, but I want to enhance it just a little bit. So I trimmed this down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches. Then I'm going to use some black soot distress ink around the outside edges just to kind of enhance the outside edges, kind of frame it in a little bit and add a little bit of visual dimension to it. Now, even after doing this, the spider webs weren't showing up quite as much as I wanted them to. So I took my Lisa Horton silver pad and just lightly brushed over that raised edges, and you can see how it really brings out that spider web detail on that background. I'm going to let that dry for just a few moments while I'm waiting for the rest of my watercolor to dry. I just love that with that black background, or the gray background with the black around the outside edges, and that silver on there just totally enhances it. Again, I'm going to tape my die in place before I run it through my die cutting machine. I don't want that to move on me. Now, one of the ways that I'm going to add a little bit of extra texture to this, I'm going to add some glossy accents on the eyes of the little monsters, as well as my little pumpkin. I think it's my pumpkin, or my ghost, my bats. I put it in a few different areas. I didn't overdo it. Sometimes when I do balloons, I'll put glossy accents right on the balloons, and I didn't do that for these. I just left it on the eyes. Sometimes less is more. I glue my spiderweb background to my A2 card base, and then we can add some glue to that sentiment as well, the image as well as the sentiment. Now, when you're working and gluing on top of embossed backgrounds, because you don't have complete contact with that entire piece of cardstock, I do make sure that I'm a little bit more liberal with that glue, just to make sure that I can get as much contact with the glue and the raised edges of those background. So I'm going to use my glossy accents. I'm doing it on the eyes of the little monsters there. I put it on the features of that pumpkin, the eyes of the ghost, as well as the bat. And then I will let that completely dry. And when it comes to glossy accents, it really just depends on how much you add as to how long it takes to dry. For those little eyes and stuff like that, I want to say probably about 15 minutes, but I would err on the side of caution and give it a half an hour or so. Again, I always err on the side of caution. What you can do is use a scrap piece of paper and put the amounts on a scrap piece of paper, and then touch that scrap piece of paper if you wanted to test and see if it's completely dry. For the next card, I'm going to use that large die of the month, the Boo-mobile. So I have a few of the die cuts here that I'm going to do some ink blending with that interference ink. On the little stem of the pumpkin, I put some of that Magical Garden. On the hat, I put some of that Regal Gray. On these pumpkins, I'm putting some pumpkin spice on there. And again, it's just going to add that little bit of ink, but we're also going to see that little touch of shimmer from the interference colors. You could also do this with just plain dye-based inks if you want, but you just don't get that little bit of shimmer. And I think that takes it to the next level. It gives it something unexpected. So once I have those pieces done, I can put those to the side and we can start assembling. Now, when I have something like this that has a ton of pieces to it, I lay everything out close to where they go on the base dies so that I know exactly where all of those pieces are. I know that I have everything out there ready to go, and I don't have to worry about where my pieces are and fumbling through a pile of die cuts and hoping I didn't lose something. I can check everything before I start to assemble. This is what works for me. This is a great thing to do for someone that might be new to die cuts, especially layered die cuts like this that have a ton of pieces. It takes the overwhelm out of it, because obviously as you add the pieces to it, you have less pieces to choose from, and it gets a little bit easier as we go. It also, in my opinion, makes it a little bit easier to kind of figure out which step should be next, like putting the teeth in the pumpkin before you put it on the base, because you can see those teeth right there. I am typically the first person that will kind of get ahead of myself and forget different bits if I don't have them laid out for me. So by having everything laid out and ready to go, I tend to forget the order a little bit less. So as I'm going, I'm just putting that liquid glue on the back of pieces, putting the other pieces on top of them where they should go. What I'll typically do during this is put an acrylic block on some of the areas that as they're drying, but I'm going to wait for this because there's so many pieces going on at a time. I just wait until I have a majority of them all together, and then I'll put my acrylic block on there and make sure that it holds everything nice and flat while it's drying. For the really teeny tiny pieces, I will use my wax tip tool from my handy tool set. It comes in handy when you're using these layering dies because it puts a little indent showing you where the upper layer is supposed to go, so you know exactly where to put that glue. Then you can just lift up that tiny little piece and then just add it on top of that bit of glue there. Gonna put that hat together. This hat goes on top of the card. There's also a little eyeball that you could add and you can die cut out. I opted not to do the eyeball because it just looked a little weird to me, so I just left that off, but you certainly could add that if you want. For the little buckle on the witch's hat, I used some matte silver cardstock from the Treasured Cardstock pack. I just chose the matte finish because I didn't want it to be too flashy, but you could use whatever finish you want. You could also just use white cardstock and use that Lisa Horton silver pad on cardstock scraps in order to create your own metallic paper. So once I have most of these pieces together, we can start assembling these guys right into the card. And you want to make sure not to put the back part of the card that's on the top right of my screen on that card before you put the little characters inside them. I almost did that and then realized my mistake. Now I wanted to add just a touch of movement to this card. So I'm taking the small spinners from Spellbinders. These are ones that they are just releasing this month. They're super easy to use. I'm using them with micro glue dots or really tiny glue dots, putting the spinner on that glue dot and then adding it to the card. And I'm going to do it on the little skull feature on the front of that card. I did a video in July where I did it on the Summer Ween collection and used it for a beach ball and a card. It's a fun little simple thing to use to just add some movement to a card. Now obviously because it has some dimension to it, I would think you would need like a padded envelope just to protect it because they are metal. So I would pick and choose who I would send these to. I wouldn't be sending them to everyone because it is going to add some extra thickness to that card, and the post office might not be so happy about that. So this would be something that I would hand someone. It was also, when you have cards like this that have movement to it, it's also fun seeing their reaction to that movement as well. For the background for this card, I'm once again using the Spiderweb 3D embossing folder. I'm using it with some lilac cardstock so that our little Boo Mobile is really going to show up well on it. So I have it done, and I'm going to use the black soot distress ink around the outside edges once again, just framing that in. It's going to tie in some of those black elements from the die cuts as well. Now, once we have this done, I just took that black pad and ran it over. Again, it just shows up those spiderweb details just a little bit better, and I wanted to do something just a little bit different from the last one. I just love the look of that in the purple and black as well. I think this is going to become one of my favorite embossing folders for the fall, just because I tend to love spiderweb backgrounds. I'm not really sure. I'm not a really huge fan of spiders, but for Halloween and for fall, I do like spiderweb backgrounds. So I'm going to glue that straight on my A2 card base, and then we can add our Boo Mobile right to that. Again, being liberal with the glue so that it has some really good contact with those raised areas of that embossed background. This die set comes with a sentiment there. There's two flags that say "Hey Boo" that I just thought would be perfect. So I'm putting that on the top of the card. So here is the card at the moment. I'm going to add a little bit of glossy accents to the headlights of the card, and I'm also going to add them to the eyes of the ghost. It's just going to give a little bit of extra texture to it. This is a detail that you can eliminate if you don't want to, but I always think it just takes it to the next level and adds just a little bit more detail. So I'm going to set that aside to completely dry while I'm working on the next card. And for the next one, I'm using the Boo Crew Lab die of the month. This has some beakers to it that I wanted the ingredients to glow. So I had two pieces of cardstock, one that's hammer mill cardstock, one that's peridot cardstock, that I put some of this grit placed glow on and let it dry. Now I did it the day before, so I wanted to make sure that it was 100% dry, especially because I wanted to die cut this afterwards. It's much easier to die cut after it's completely dry than to take a die cut and try to put that grit paste glow on there. So I make sure that it is well and dry, because that pressure of that die cutting machine, if it's not 100% dry, we're going to get a little bit of weird things happening. So by doing it the day before, knowing I wanted to do that, it made it really easy to make sure it was 100% dry. Now just be warned, especially for a die like this, because there's those little bubbles in there, it's not going to want to cut through all of those bubbles. So I left some of the inserted parts of the bubbles in some of the ones that didn't cut through, just as little bubble detail. I poked the ones that did cut all the way through, and you can see that I put my die through the machine first with the blade side down, then I flipped the whole thing over, put it with the blade side up, and I also put it towards the edge of my plate where there's a little bit more pressure there. So it just had a better chance of cutting through. It also depends on how thick you put your paste on the cardstock. This totally works. I've done this many times, but it works better for simple shapes where the paste is also a little bit on the thinner side. So when I put it on the cardstock, I try to make it as thin as possible, but still have a even amount of that paste on there. And then I set it aside to completely dry. The bases of my beakers are die cut out of some matte silver cardstock from that treasured cardstock pack. Again, I wanted them to have a little bit of a different look to them, so I chose the matte silver cardstock. Another option would be to use some acetate, then you would be able to see right through them. But I typically like the silver to it because I wanted to have those beakers to have a little bit more presence on the card. For the rest of the die cuts here, we have the candle flames, and those were just die cut out of some beeswax cardstock. I am going to be using the pumpkin spice interference ink to add a little bit of color to the bases of them. I have 2 pieces to each one of these candles. The base part or the background part is just raven cardstock, and then I did them in lilac cardstock, carrot cardstock, as well as peridot cardstock. And then for the books, there are 2 different options to create words on the spine. So I did one of each, doing one of them in peridot, one of them in the carrot cardstock, and then I did one book in anchor cardstock, but I didn't put the words on the spine, so you can easily eliminate that. That is just a separate piece that gets inserted into the die when you're die cutting, but you don't have to if you don't want to. So I'm going to add some of that pumpkin spice to the flames, and originally I was only going to do it on the flames and leave the rest of the die cuts as is, but I changed my mind and decided to add some of that pumpkin spice to the book as well as the base of the candle. Then I decided to pull out the peridot pieces and add that Magic Garden interference ink to those ones. The ink blending definitely takes those die cuts to the next level, and I love the little bit of shimmer that the interference inks gives, but you definitely don't have to use interference inks if you don't have them or if you don't want them. You could just use regular inks to get just the color on there, that little bit of visual dimension. On the gray book, I put a little bit of that Regal Gray interference ink, and then I realized I missed my candle, so I grabbed that Magic Garden once again. I am trying to put them on different areas of my mat so I don't get any of those inks contaminated with them. It's pretty easy with the interference inks to see exactly where you've used them because it adds a little bit of a shimmer to the mat, but it does wash right off. So it comes right off of the mat. You don't have to worry about that, but it does make it easier to know exactly what you've colored where. Then I'm going to add those flames to the candles and create, once again, another spiderweb background. You can tell that the spiderweb was definitely my favorite because I think I used it on 5 cards. I know 4 for sure, but I think it was actually 5 cards that I used it on. It just creates a nice texture for the background, but it's such a simple one that I think works with many different die cuts as well as stamped images and is a nice fall background. So for this one, I chose fog cardstock. I did try to make sure to use different colored cardstocks for them so you could see it in a variety of different ways. I'm using some Hickory Smoke Distress ink around the outside edges, and then I just used my Regal Gray interference pad and just rubbed over the top edges. Now, once again, these pads are foam, so they have a lot of give to them. So when you're rubbing over a surface, an embossed surface, you want to have a very, very light hand with it because it's too easy to press just a little bit too hard and get ink on your background. After doing it over the raised surface, I decided to add some of that around the outside edges as well. I didn't put it everywhere, like I didn't completely cover the hickory smoke, just added that little extra bit of deepening of the ink blending. Once again, I did not trim this down. I'm going to cover the full A2 card base here. And when I do put it on a full background, I will lay it down, but then I will lift it up and kind of tap so that the edges meet on the folded side. I want to make sure that it's on there nice and flat. Then we can start adding our different die cuts to that background. So I started with the orange book. Then I added one of my beakers because I wanted one of them kind of behind the stack of books and then one of them on top of the stack of books. And my stack of books there are kind of jaggedy even. I wanted them to look a little bit haphazard on there. Then I added the other beaker on there, and now we can finish off with the stack by adding the little candles on there. There's also some bat die cuts that I have to the side that I'm going to be adding once I am done with my little stack here. I wanted to make sure that I had room for them. I didn't want them to be hidden behind that stack. I picked one of the sentiments that we had done from the clear stamp of the month, and then there are 2 different sizes of bats. So they are on the same die, so I cut 2 of both sizes, and then I cut an additional small bat because I wanted to have a few more than just a couple bats on that background there, but the smaller ones kind of fill in the space, but they don't overwhelm it. So I cut a few extras of the small ones there. Once again, using Barely Art glue, I just use it, have it in a fine line bottle, so it works perfectly for both assembling my card as well as just adding the little die cuts on there. I'm going to put some glossy accents on the flames of the candles as well as the top of the candle. I want it to look like a little bit like dripping wax on the candle, and glossy accents is the perfect way to do that. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to set it aside to dry, but I'll show you an inlay of it completely glowing in the dark. So you can see it there in the top left corner, and obviously when it's glowing in the dark you can't see all the other features, but it is a fun surprise element to it. So next we're ready to work on our stitching die of the month. So these have inserts for the stitching pieces, and I cut two different pieces, one with the stitching and one without. When I do stitching dies, I like to glue a solid piece on the back. Sometimes it'll be a piece that has the stitching detail in it. It encloses that floss and it also thickens that piece up, and it makes it easier when I'm assembling my card. So when you die cut stitching dies, it'll typically put a little indent where that stitching is supposed to go. Makes it super easy to know how it is intended to be stitched. I also use a little piece of Best Ever Craft tape to tape my floss down at the beginning to make sure that it doesn't accidentally pull out on me. It makes it stays nice and secure. This one is kind of a little haphazard stitching. It does give you that little indent showing you where they intend to stitch, but there's not really a rhyme or reason to it. So I am doing 6 of these total. I'm going to just do one of them on camera and I'll do the rest of them off screen. It's very repetitive. So I use my strings of floss. I divide it so there's just 2 strands of floss to it, so that it's a little bit thinner. You could have it a little bit thicker if you wanted it to. I chose to use just kind of a cream colored floss. I would have used gray, but I actually didn't have any gray floss, but you can use whatever color you want. You could even use like a silver or a white metallic if you wanted. That would be fun as well. Once I have these pieces stitched, I will go and I will glue on that solid piece to the back of it. Once all of my pieces are stitched, I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending on them. I want them to look a little bit kind of grungy, so I'm going to add that little bit of ink blending to it. Now, when I glue the piece on the back, there's a little bit of dimension to that floss on the back, so I don't want to sit there and hold it while that glue is drying. So I use some sewing clips to clip those 2 pieces together, and then I can set those aside to completely dry while I'm working on the next piece. Now, these pieces here have about a 1/2 inch on each end that don't have any stitching on them. So this is going to work well for a vertical A2 card. It's going to go beyond the edges of that A2 card, and then once everything is completely dry, I'm going to cut off those excess pieces. So when you do the stitching, it's done that way intentionally, and I love the fact that you have that little bit of extra wiggle room so you can tilt these pieces as you're assembling and not have to worry about the pieces being too short. So I have my 6 stitched ones there on the left side. On the right side, I have some pieces that are just plain that are die cut out of some fog cardstock. I'm using some Lost Shadow Distress ink on those white stitched pieces. On the fog ones, I go and use some Hickory Smoke, but I'm really light-handed with it. Again, I want them to be grungy, but I don't want them to be completely covered in ink. For my background, I'm going to be using some anchor cardstock, so it's going to be even darker than this. So these pieces are going to show up nicely. And you can see that I'm ink blending them super quickly. I'm not being super careful with it. I don't need it to be pristinely ink blended. I just want to have a little bit of ink on there. Again, just grunging it up just a little bit. So once those pieces are done, we can take them off of the mat. And I'm going to be using the opposite side of the Spooky Web 3D embossing folder. I'm going to be using the side with the stitching on it. This is going to be the perfect background for our little mummy looking card here. So I stitched that there, and then I'm going to use some Black Soot Distress ink around the outside edges just to give it a little bit more visual dimension. Now, a lot of this ink blending here is hidden. We're not going to see a ton of it, but I think it does add some interest and it frames it in around the outside edges. I just really like the look of it. So I did that really quickly as well. Then we have our eye pieces that I want to assemble. So the base of the eye is just die cut out of white. The color of the eye is die cut out of some peridot cardstock. And then we have the pupils for the eye that is just raven cardstock, and those eyebrows are also raven. I also have 2 little cheeks there that are die cut out of some blush cardstock, and then we have the teeth to the side there that are die cut out of just plain white cardstock. However, it would also be fun to die cut them out of the mirror finish cardstock in the Antique White Treasure cardstock pack. It's got a glow, or sorry, it's got a shine to it. It looks like glossy cardstock basically. That would be fun as well. I opted not to simply because there's a lot going on with those stitch pieces and stuff like that. So I didn't think we really needed to have glossy teeth to it, but it would be a fun feature if you wanted to change it up just a little bit. So I'm going to start off with my lower teeth, then I'm going to add a few strips, and I'm going to start off with the Fog unstitched strips first. Those are just to add extra detail to it. So I don't want any of those unstitched pieces on the upper layers. I only want the stitched ones in the upper layers. Then I'm going to start adding some strips to the top, and you can see how handy it is to have that extra space on the two ends of these pieces, so I don't have to worry about making sure they're pristinely placed because I have that extra little space there. So I'm going to do all of my gray strips first, and then I'm going to add these stitched ones on top of it so that the stitched ones are really the ones that are the focal point. I'm going to add my upper teeth here before I forget. Then we can add some of those upper pieces. Now, when it comes to those upper pieces, because these layers have 2 layers of cardstock, we have our stitched cardstock and then our solid cardstock behind it, it's going to add a lot of extra dimension to it. I'm going to put 3 right onto the background. Any of the ones that go over top of any of the stitched areas, I do want to make sure to let dry for a little bit longer so that that glue has a chance to really grab on some of those upper layers there. That's really going to make a difference for this last one here. So I put my acrylic block on there and then let that completely dry before moving on to the next step. Once that is dry, we can start adding the eyes and then the eyebrows. Now, I originally put my eyes on there just a little bit too close, so I do adjust it. This is the nice thing about using a liquid glue, is it gives you that little bit of wiggle room. If you change your mind on something, you can always move it a little bit. Now, because we have the stitching on there, it also is raised just a touch because of the little stitching detail. Once we have the eyes and the eyebrows, we can add those little cheek blushed pieces. Then we can add our sentiment. Put it in the bottom of the card, but you could always put it on the inside of the card if you wanted. Now, once everything is completely dry, I will use my shears and I will turn the card over, and then I will cut off those excess pieces on the side. Easy enough to cut through them just following the edges or the lines of the card, but you do want to make sure that everything is completely dry before you do this. Otherwise, you're going to have pieces falling off the front. So a little bit of extra patience to make sure that everything is 100% dry. Now, once again, I thought I wanted to add a little bit of extra visual dimension, so I put a little bit of glossy accents on the eyes just to give them that glossy dome dimension. Now, when you first put glossy accents on, it has like a milky haze to it, but that does dry completely clear. So I'm going to set that aside to dry while we're working on our next card, and we're going to be using the All Clubs Crate exclusive die set, the Scaredy Cat. Now, I had everything die cut, and I just had some plain peridot cardstock for the eyes, but while I was creating the rest of the cards in this video, I decided it would be really fun if the eyes glowed on the cat. So while I was doing cards earlier, off to the side, I put a little bit of that grit paste glow onto some peridot cardstock and then set it aside to dry. And rather than die cutting those pieces, they're just rectangles and it goes right behind. We're not going to see the edges. I decided to just use my scissors and trim them. So I'm going to glue those behind the eyes, and it doesn't change the color of the cardstock too much. It makes it like a touch more yellow, but I think it's going to be really fun for those eyes and also really spooky for the recipient when they first see these eyes in the middle of the night glowing at them. But a little fun feature. It also gives them a little bit of a different texture to them. I added some glue in some of the areas where the upper layers went. So we have our little insert pieces for the ears. Those are die cut out of blush cardstock, our little nose, and then this little cat here has some teeny tiny fangs to it. So we're going to glue those on there as well and let those sit and dry. The pieces that are going to take longest to dry is that grit paste textured cardstock that I put behind the eyes because of that little bit of extra grit paste there. It is going to dry totally fine, but you want to give it just a few extra moments because of that extra texture. Then this cat here has a little skeleton collar. So I put the 2 layers on that skeleton there, and the pieces for the metal on that collar is done with some mirror cardstock from the Silver Treasured cardstock pack. I'm going to use the spider web once again with some lilac cardstock for the background for this card. So I just use A2 pieces of that cardstock. It fits in the areas of that embossing folder really nicely. I don't need to trim it down if I'm not going to trim it down for my card, but you certainly could if you want to. This particular die kind of goes all the way to the edges of the die. So again, I didn't think it was necessary to add that trimmed down background to it. So once I have the piece embossed, I did some black soot distress ink around the outside edges and then went over top of those spider webs with that silver pad. It's going to bring out not only the spider webs, but it's also going to tie the silver with the silver on the little collar of the cat. So I'm going to put the corner piece on first, then we're going to put the tail piece above it. And once again, make sure that you're liberal with that glue so that it has contact with the upper layers of that embossed background. Now you'll notice when I go to put my sentiment on in just a moment that cat tail moves. It takes a few moments for that glue to really grab, especially when you're working with an embossed piece. So just give it a few moments. This is really where having an acrylic block or having something heavy to lay on top of it while that is drying is really, really helpful. Then I'm going to add my sentiment to the top corner here. This is where the tail moves on me, but it's easy enough to move back. Then I put that acrylic block on there and let that totally dry. Now, last step here, I want to add a little bit of dimension. So I just add it to the nose and the fangs or the teeth of the cat here. Now, because the glossy accents kind of creates rounded edges, I just use my die pick and draw out that glossy accents to give him some pointy fangs. So once this is done, I'm gonna let that completely dry. Here is the finished card, and in the top right, you can see those glowy eyes. That one, you can actually see some of the die cut pieces in there, so you can actually see some of the detail, but I just love the look of those glowy eyes. The last card I'm gonna create is using the Make a Monster. Now, you can get really creative with this, use this with other die sets. It really is just the face pieces to this. I have them die cut out of classic white cardstock and Raven cardstock, and I'm just gluing them together, and my tongue is die cut out of some poppy cardstock. I chose to do 2 different sized eyes to make him a little bit of a wonky looking monster. Now, to add some extra texture to this card, I'm choosing to do the base of my monster in some velvet cardstock here. So I have some orange adhesive velvet cardstock. I'm just going to glue it to my card. I have it trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Now, he could be a monster, or it could be just the side, like the face focused in for a carved pumpkin if you want it to be. So you can get creative with this. I'm going to add a sentiment to the top of the card. You'll notice when I go to put my acrylic block on there that sentiment moves a little bit, so I have to correct it. When you're using velvet cardstock, it does take a little bit longer to dry because it takes a bit for that glue to seep into that cardstock, and then it starts to set, so you do want to be patient with that. I used a little bit more glossy accents on the eyes. I always love having glossy domed dimension on eyes. I think it just gives it something extra, and they almost look like googly eyes except without the movement. You could even use googly eyes with this. I think that would be fun. So all of the cards here, I have everything that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. If there's something that I've forgotten to mention, just pop it in the comments. I'm happy to answer. This was such a fun one to do. I'm not typically a Halloween person, but I always love adding different pieces that glow when it comes to Halloween. I'm not sure why I do it with just Halloween, but it's a fun way to just change up your creating in just a little way. I love that little stitched mummy for that card. The fact that that mummy is that whole face of the card is really fun. Then we have our little lab there with the glow-in-the-dark potions. Now you could also use, say, some purple cardstock or some other cardstock with that grit paste glow on there to make them glow. However, just remember that the yellow on top with that color from that grit paste glow is going to change up whatever color cardstock you put underneath there. Then we have our Boo-mobile with those little spinning skull lights there, or skull pieces there. So fun. And I love just the texture of that spider web in the background there. Then we have our watercolored little monsters with their Halloween balloons. And of course, on top of another spider web background. You can tell what my favorite embossing folder from this set was because I ended up using it a whole lot. Then we have our Better Press of the month, the Boo Humbug. This one here was done with a Better Press system with that glow-in-the-dark embossing powder. Then the other one done with the Glimmer system with that opal foil. So that opal foil has some really fun iridescence to it. And then the ink blending on the background really make that ghost stand out on the background. And I love the extra texture you get from the die cut ghost on top of it. Our stencil of the month, such a fun background for cards, just kind of cheery with that, all of those little ghosts and pumpkins and then the bats. And I love that extra texture with the glitter on the bats. Then we have our Happy Jacks. Simple, simple, simple card, but with the surprise element of those glow in the dark faces on it. I think it just adds something fun, something interesting, and something not expected to the card there. So I turned my lights on but off, but once again, because I couldn't completely take out all of the light, you don't see the glow nearly as much as you do when all of the lights are off, like the pictures that I inlaid in there. But I did want to take a moment and show it a little bit. I was hoping it would show up a little bit more than this on the video, but it doesn't. It is what it is. But they are fun elements that are super easy to add to your card making, and you don't have to limit it to just Halloween. I typically do. I don't really know why, but they're fun things, just surprise things, just little elements that make handmade cards fun, things that you don't necessarily get when you buy a store-bought card. So here is that cat. I just love the glowing lights in the dark. I think it just makes them look a little bit more eerie and totally suits them. Once again, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.